When my mom died, I barely had time to process the loss before everything in my life shifted like quicksand under my feet. I went from standing at her funeral, trying to hold back tears in front of everyone, to staring at the cold walls of my stepfather Charles's house, wondering how I ended up here. We've been close once, when he'd first come into our lives, but that was years ago. Somewhere along the line, he'd changed, his warmth turning into something icy and sharp, his promises to look out for me dissolving like smoke. And now he was the only family I had left. The first day in his house, I tried to make myself small, quiet. I was hoping he'd just leave me alone. I kept thinking he'd soften up, that maybe he was grieving too, in his own weird way. But the moment the door closed behind us, he dropped the kind words and hollow condolences. His voice was hard, even as he kept his smile in place, like he was reading off a script. "This is your home now," he said, gesturing to the lavish living room with a wave of his hand. "But remember, Emily, we all have to earn our keep." That was the first sign, and I knew something was wrong, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe he just didn't know how to talk to a grieving teenager. But things only got worse from there. The next morning, I found a neatly written list on the kitchen counter with my name at the top in his small, precise handwriting. The list was simple: clean the bathrooms, do the dishes, vacuum the upstairs rooms. At the bottom, a note was scrawled in the same neat script: everyone contributes to the household. I stood there for a second, reading it over, feeling the floor sway beneath me. I'd expected that maybe, for once, someone would be there to help me, to care for me. But instead, I was assigned to clean a house that didn't feel like home. Every day, the list grew longer. Dust the shelves, wash the floors, organize the storage room. And as if the chores weren't enough, Charles always found a way to let me know how much he thought I didn't belong here. He'd watch me as I cleaned, inspecting every corner like he was just waiting to find a mistake. When I'd miss a spot, he'd smile that tight, smug smile and say, "Sloppy work isn't tolerated in my house, Emily. Your mother would be disappointed." I would bite my tongue, clenching my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms, fighting the urge to scream. Every word felt like a dagger, twisting in the raw place where my mother's memory lived. Over the weeks, I learned my place in his house. I ate meals alone in the kitchen, with Charles dining in the formal dining room, separated by a closed door. I wasn't allowed in the living room unless I was cleaning, and he'd grumble if I left anything out of place, like I was contaminating his perfect, pristine world. I was an outsider, tolerated only as long as I stayed quiet and did my part. There were moments when I'd catch myself standing in the quiet of my tiny room, my hands shaking as I tried to hold back tears. I missed my mom so much it hurt, a constant, sharp ache that sat in my chest, throbbing every time I thought of her. She'd always told me I was stronger than I knew, but now her voice was just a faint whisper, drowned out by Charles's cold demands. And then one evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Charles came into the kitchen with that familiar look of distaste. "Emily," he said, his voice dripping with barely disguised irritation, "I need you to take care of the yard tomorrow. The front and back. The neighbors are already starting to talk." I stared at him, feeling my face flush. "The yard?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I'd already spent the entire day scrubbing floors, my back aching and my hands raw. He raised an eyebrow, like I was somehow the one being unreasonable. "Yes, the yard. I don't think that's too much to ask, considering all I'm doing for you. A roof over your head, food on the table. I'd say you owe me." It was like a slap to the face. Every time he threw my mother's memory back at me, it twisted something deep inside. I swallowed the sharp retort that clawed at my throat, biting down hard on my lip. I didn't have a choice. I knew if I spoke up, it would only make things worse. The next morning, I was out in the yard before the sun was even fully up, dragging the heavy lawnmower across the grass, pulling weeds with my bare hands. My fingers were sore and blistered by the time I was finished, dirt crusted under my nails, sweat soaking through my clothes. I stood there, staring at the neat, trimmed lawn, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and hollow satisfaction. But when I came back inside, sweaty and tired, Charles barely looked up from his coffee. Make sure you don't track mud on the floors, he said, his voice laced with that familiar condescension. This house needs to stay presentable. I have guests coming over later. I clenched my jaw, my entire body buzzing with frustration. No matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. I was just a means to an end for him, someone to keep his life in order, someone he could control. As the days turned into weeks, I learned to navigate his world, staying quiet, keeping to the background. I'd started applying to colleges before my mom passed, and despite everything, I clung to that dream. It was the one thing that kept me going, the one escape I could still imagine. If I could just get into a good school, far from here, I could leave this place and never look back. I poured everything into my art portfolio, spending late nights sketching quietly in my room, keeping my supplies hidden so Charles wouldn't find them and throw them away. Art was the one thing I had left that felt like mine, the one part of me that he couldn't control. And when I found out about the scholarship, it felt like a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The scholarship was competitive, but if I won, it would cover everything: tuition, room, and board. I wouldn't need to rely on Charles. I'd finally be free, but getting the scholarship meant keeping it a secret. If Charles knew, I knew he'd find some way to ruin it, to keep me tied to this house and his rules. So I hid everything: application forms, sketches, letters from the scholarship committee, tucking them away in a hidden corner of my closet, praying he'd never find them. As the interview date approached, I felt a strange mix of hope and fear building inside me. It was the first time in months I'd felt anything close to happiness, a real chance at freedom just within reach. I started to imagine what life would be like away from here, away from him. I clung to that glimmer of hope like it was my lifeline. The day of the scholarship interview was coming up fast, and I was doing everything I could to stay off Charles's radar. I kept to myself, worked through his lists without a word, and never left anything out of place that might catch his attention. But every day, a new task seemed to pop up. First, it was cleaning out the attic, a dusty space no one had touched in years. Then, it was polishing the silverware for some event he was hosting. Anything, it seemed, to keep me busy, to keep me from even thinking about anything beyond these walls. Late at night, when the house was finally quiet, I'd sneak into my closet, pulling out my sketches and poring over them in the dim light. My fingers traced each line, each careful detail, my mind filling with visions of what my life could look like if I could just get out. I imagined a life where I wasn't treated like a maid, a life where I could actually breathe. The night before my interview, I barely slept. I was too anxious, my mind running over every possible scenario, every possible question they could ask me. I knew I'd have to be on my game, to impress them, to show them I was worth taking a chance on. But more than that, I was scared that somehow Charles would find out and ruin it all before I even had the chance to try. The next morning, I got up before dawn, careful not to wake him. I dressed quietly, slipping into the only decent clothes I owned, a plain blouse and a skirt that was a little too short, but the best I had. I was just about to head out the door when Charles's voice stopped me in my tracks. "Where do you think you're going?" My heart dropped. I turned slowly, trying to keep my face neutral. I have I have a meeting for school." I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. Charles raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "A meeting for school? Funny. I didn't know you had any school left to attend. Aren't you just coasting on my goodwill now?" I bit down on my tongue, forcing myself to stay calm. "It's just something for my portfolio," I said, hoping he'd let it go. But he didn't. Instead, his eyes narrowed, and he took a step toward me, his gaze flicking down to the bag in my hand. "Show me what's in the bag," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. My heart raced as I tightened my grip on the bag. "It's just my sketches," I said, trying to sound casual, but I could feel the tension building in the air. "Hand it over, Emily," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Reluctantly, I held out the bag, watching as he rifled through it, pulling out my portfolio. He flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing with every sketch he saw, every piece of my soul laid bare on the paper. Is this why you've been so distracted lately? He sneered, holding up one of my drawings. You think some scribbles on paper are going to get you anywhere? I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation, but I forced myself to keep my head high. It's more than that, I said, my voice shaking. It's a scholarship. If I get it, I can leave. For a moment, a flicker of something dark crossed his face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that same cold, mocking expression. Oh, you think you're going to escape that easily? He asked, his tone dripping with condescension. You really think they'd waste money on you? Please, Emily. You're nothing more than a charity case, a burden I've been kind enough to take on. I clenched my fists, every word stabbing deeper. I don't need your help, I said through gritted teeth. I just need you to let me go to the interview. Charles stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. Finally, he smiled, a cruel twist of his mouth. Fine, he said, handing back my portfolio. I'll even drive you. After all, it's only fair that I make sure you're well prepared. My stomach churned, but I forced a nod. Thank you, I mumbled, unable to look him in the eye. The drive to the interview was silent, tension thick in the air. I clutched my portfolio in my lap, staring out the window, trying to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. Charles hadn't said a word since we'd left the house, his face set in an unreadable mask. I could feel his gaze flicking over to me every so often, like he was waiting for the right moment to strike. When we finally arrived, I reached for the door handle, ready to escape his presence, but his hand shot out, grabbing my arm in a tight grip. Remember, Emily, he said, his voice a low murmur. Don't embarrass me. After all, if you fail here, it only reflects badly on me. I yanked my arm free, swallowing down the anger that bubbled up in my chest. I won't fail, I said, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. As I walked into the building, I tried to shake off his words, his presence, focusing on what I needed to do. This was my one chance, the opportunity I'd been working for all these months. I couldn't let him ruin it for me. The interview went better than I could have hoped. The panel seemed impressed with my portfolio, nodding and smiling as they looked over my work. They asked about my inspiration, my plans for the future, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was being seen, like someone actually believed in me. But just as the interview was wrapping up, the door creaked open and Charles stepped in, his face twisted in a polite but insincere smile. Excuse me, he said, nodding to the panel. I just wanted to check in on my stepdaughter here. Emily's had a rough time since her mother passed, you see. She's been through a lot, and sometimes, well, she struggles with the pressure. My heart plummeted as his words sank in, and I felt the panel's eyes shift, their smiles faltering. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside, I was screaming. One of the interviewers cleared his throat, glancing between me and Charles. Emily, is that true? Have you been feeling overwhelmed? I opened my mouth, desperate to deny it, but Charles spoke before I could. She's a talented girl, truly, he said smoothly, but you know how teenagers are. Emotional, unpredictable. I just hope she's ready for the commitment that a scholarship like this requires. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my anger in check, but I could see the panel's expressions shifting, their initial enthusiasm dimming. Charles was planting seeds of doubt, undermining me in the worst possible way. Thank you for sharing that, one of the panelists said, nodding at Charles. It's important for us to understand the whole picture. Charles gave a humble nod, like he was some concerned guardian looking out for my best interests, and I wanted nothing more than to scream, to make them see him for what he truly was. But I was trapped, forced to sit there as he dismantled everything I'd worked for, all with that same smug smile on his face. When the interview finally ended, I could barely breathe, every ounce of hope drained from me. I walked out of the building, numb and hollow, barely aware of Charles's presence beside me as we headed back to the car. Well, he said as we got in, a satisfied smirk on his face. That wasn't so hard, was it? I didn't answer, staring out the window, my chest tight with anger and grief. He'd taken everything from me, my chance at freedom, my one shot at a life outside his grasp. As we drove home, his words echoed in my mind, each one a reminder of just how trapped I was. I wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out, but I knew it would only give him more satisfaction. So I sat there in silence, letting the rage simmer, promising myself that somehow, someday, I'd find a way out. Back at the house, I locked myself in my room, my hands shaking as I clutched my ruined portfolio. I could still hear his voice in my head, mocking me, tearing down everything I'd worked for. I wanted to destroy something, to let the anger out, but all I could do was sit there, feeling the weight of everything crash down on me. For hours, I stayed there, replaying the events over and over, the bitter sting of betrayal settling deep into my bones. When the shock and anger from the interview finally began to fade, I was left with a hollow ache, a kind of exhaustion that sank so deep it felt like it had seeped into my bones. I'd worked so hard, and Charles had taken it all away in a matter of minutes, leaving me with nothing but the bitterness of lost dreams. The days that followed were numb and empty. I moved through them like a ghost, doing whatever he told me to do, barely registering his voice or the chores he assigned. Every time I looked at my art supplies, I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me, like I'd been stripped of everything that made me me. I stopped drawing altogether. What was the point? Charles made it clear that he'd never let me go, never let me have anything that he couldn't control. And it wasn't just the scholarship, he was determined to ruin anything that brought me a sense of worth, of independence. I was just his puppet, his burden, trapped under his thumb with no way out. Days blurred together, each one filled with more chores, more demands, and more of his sharp words cutting into me. Every time he looked at me, it was with a mix of disdain and amusement, as if he enjoyed watching me shrink. I learned to keep my head down, to avoid his gaze, and to swallow every biting remark he threw my way. But the anger still simmered beneath the surface, a low, pulsing fire I couldn't ignore. One night, after a particularly grueling day of cleaning out the garage, a task he insisted needed to be done by me and me alone, I finally reached my breaking point. I was exhausted, covered in grime, and the muscles in my arms felt like they were on fire. As I scrubbed the last corner of the floor, Charles appeared in the doorway, his expression twisted into that familiar look of contempt. "You missed a spot," he sneered, pointing to a tiny speck of dirt near the door. I didn't even have the energy to respond. I just dropped the rag and stared at him, my body trembling with a mix of exhaustion and barely contained fury. "Don't you dare look at me like that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You should be grateful. I've given you everything you need, and yet you act like a spoiled child. Do you really think you deserve better?" Something inside me snapped. The words spilled out before I could stop them. "You haven't given me anything," I spat, my voice shaking. "You took everything from me. My mom, my future, everything." For a moment, there was silence. Then he laughed, a cold, cruel sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Your mother left you with nothing, Emily. I'm the only reason you have a roof over your head. Without me, you'd be on the street, just another nobody." I wanted to scream, to tear down everything in sight, but I knew it would only make things worse. Instead, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "One day, I'll get out of here," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "And when I do, I'll never look back." Charles's eyes narrowed, his mouth twisting into a sneer. "Keep dreaming, Emily. But don't forget, you're stuck here as long as I say so." He turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving me alone in the darkened garage. I slumped against the wall, my chest heaving with suppressed sobs, every inch of me burning with a desperate need to escape. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, a new thought began to take shape. I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for some miracle to come along and rescue me. If I wanted to get out, I'd have to find a way myself. And if that meant going behind Charles's back, then so be it. The next morning, I woke with a new sense of determination. I moved quietly, keeping to my routine, making sure not to do anything that would draw attention. I knew that if I was going to pull this off, I have to be careful. Charles had a way of sniffing out even the slightest hint of rebellion, and if he caught on to my plans, he'd crush them without a second thought. Over the next few weeks, I started looking for odd jobs around town, things I could do on the side without him knowing. I found a part time gig at a local bookstore, working a few hours every evening after finishing my chores. It wasn't much, but it was something. I told Charles the first was going to a study group, and he didn't question it, probably because he didn't think I had the nerve to do anything behind his back. With each paycheck, I tucked away a little more, hiding the cash in an old shoebox under my bed. It wasn't enough to leave yet, but it was a start. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope, a sense of purpose that kept me going, even when Charles's words tried to drag me down. The job at the bookstore became my sanctuary. The smell of old paper and leather-bound books, the quiet hum of the store. It was the only place I felt like I could breathe, where I wasn't just Charles's unwanted burden. I even made a friend, a girl named Lily, who worked the morning shift and sometimes stayed late to chat with me. She was the first person in ages who treated me like a human being, who didn't look at me with pity or judgment. One night, as we were closing up, Lily leaned against the counter, watching me with a curious expression. "You ever think about leaving this town?" she asked, her tone casual, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder, even though I knew Charles wasn't there. "Every day," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Lily nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Then what's stopping you?" I swallowed, the weight of my reality pressing down on me. I I can't just leave. I don't have anywhere to go. And even if I did, he'd find a way to stop me. For a moment, she was silent, studying me with a thoughtful look. Then she reached into her bag, pulling out a slip of paper and scribbling something down. "If you ever decide you're ready," she said, sliding the paper across the counter, "call this number. It's a friend of mine in the city. She helps people get back on their feet. I'm sure she could help you too." I stared at the number, my heart pounding. It felt like a lifeline, a thread of hope in a world that had turned so dark. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. She smiled, squeezing my hand. "Don't thank me yet. Just don't let anyone hold you back, okay? You deserve better than this." I tucked the paper into my pocket, feeling a new sense of resolve settle over me. I wasn't ready to make the call just yet. I needed more money, a solid plan, but I knew that when the time came, I'd be ready to take that leap. In the days that followed, I worked harder than ever, saving every penny I could, making sure not to leave a single trace for Charles to find. Each dollar felt like a step closer to freedom, a piece of the life I was determined to reclaim. But Charles wasn't stupid. He could sense the shift in me, the spark of defiance that I tried so hard to hide. One night, as I was finishing up my chores, he cornered me in the hallway, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You've been awfully busy lately," he remarked, his tone casual. But there was a dangerous edge to it. "Study groups, extra hours at that bookstore. Seems like you're keeping secrets, Emily." My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm, to meet his gaze without flinching. "I'm just trying to stay out of your way," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Isn't that what you wanted?" He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smirked, leaning in close. "Just remember, Emily," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "I know everything that goes on in my house. Don't think you can pull one over on me." I held my breath, waiting for him to walk away, the threat hanging heavy in the air. But as soon as he was gone, I felt a surge of determination flood through me. I couldn't stop now, not when I was so close. I kept my head down, counting the days, watching my secret stash of money slowly grow. I was so close now, I could almost taste the freedom, feel what it would be like to breathe without the constant weight of Charles's shadow. Every penny I saved felt like another step toward breaking free from this life, from his control. I went about my days careful and quiet, doing everything I could to stay invisible. I'd learned how to fade into the background, how to be so still that even he barely noticed me anymore. But I could feel his eyes on me sometimes, a sense that he was waiting for me to slip up. The night it all changed, I was scrubbing the kitchen floor, exhausted but determined. I'd spent all day balancing his endless list of chores, my shifts at the bookstore, and a few stolen moments with my sketchbook in the back room. I'd even managed to stash a few more bills into my shoebox before he got home, feeling the weight of freedom getting just a little bit closer. I was nearly finished when I heard his footsteps in the hallway. I froze, bracing myself. Charles rarely bothered with the kitchen, but tonight, he seemed to be making a point of inspecting every corner, his expression dark and suspicious. "You've been sneaking out a lot," he said, his tone low and accusatory. "Care to explain why?" I took a slow breath, keeping my voice steady. "I work at the bookstore. I told you that." He let out a mocking laugh, folding his arms as he leaned against the counter. "And what exactly do you plan to do with the money you're earning, Emily? It's not like you have any bills to pay." I shrugged, pretending to be unaffected. "Just saving up for college, I guess." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Is that so?" His gaze flicked to the floor where I'd been scrubbing, then back to me. "Or are you planning on running away?" My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. "Why would I do that?" "Because you're an ungrateful little brat," he snapped, his voice harsh and cutting. "I take you in, I give you a place to stay, and this is how you repay me?" Sneaking around behind my back. The anger bubbled up inside me, but I forced it down, knowing that any reaction would only give him more ammunition. "I'm not sneaking around," I said, my voice as calm as I could manage. "I just want a future." "A future?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't have a future, Emily. You'll never amount to anything. You're nothing without me." The words hit like a punch, but this time I didn't let them sink in. I'd heard them too many times, felt their sting too deeply. I knew what he was trying to do, and I refused to let him win. He leaned in close, his voice a cold whisper. "Whatever you're planning, it won't work. I'll make sure of it." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the dim kitchen, his words echoing in my mind. I sat there for a long time, letting the anger and hurt wash over me, letting it fuel the fire I'd been building inside. He thought he could keep me here, that he'd break me down until I was nothing more than his obedient little servant. But he was wrong. I wasn't going to let him win. That night, after everyone was asleep, I snuck into his office. I knew it was a risk, but I also knew that I needed something more. I needed leverage, something that would give me an edge, that would make him think twice about trying to keep me here. I'd overheard bits and pieces of conversations he'd had with his business partners, enough to know that he wasn't as untouchable as he liked to pretend. I rifled through the papers on his desk, my hands shaking as I flipped through contracts and invoices, each one more incriminating than the last. He'd been hiding money, shifting it around in ways that were barely legal, using loopholes and shady deals to keep himself afloat. I took photos of everything, each piece of evidence another layer of armor that I could use if he tried to come after me. As I slipped back into my room, I felt a surge of adrenaline, a thrill I hadn't felt in months. I was getting out of here. No matter what it took, I was going to find a way to break free. In the days that followed, I played the part of the obedient stepdaughter, doing my chores without complaint, going to work, acting like nothing had changed. But inside, I was alive, every nerve buzzing with anticipation. I was so close. All I needed was a little more time. But Charles wasn't as oblivious as I'd hoped. One night, he called me into his office, his expression dark and unreadable. "Sit down," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. I took a seat, my heart pounding as he fixed me with a cold, calculating gaze. "I know you've been sneaking around," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know you think you're clever, hiding things from me. But I assure you, Emily, I see everything." I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." He leaned forward, a sinister smile tugging at his lips. "You think you can outsmart me? You think I haven't noticed the way you've been acting, the way you look at me like you're just waiting for your chance to run?" He shook his head, chuckling darkly. "I know everything, Emily. And I promise you, if you try to leave, I will destroy you." The words hit me like a slap, but this time I didn't flinch. I met his gaze, my own eyes hard and unyielding. Maybe, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I have nothing left to lose. For a moment, there was silence, a tense, charged silence that hung heavy in the air. Then he laughed, a low, mocking sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "I'll be watching, Emily. And the moment you make a mistake, I'll be there." I left his office, the weight of his threat pressing down on me, but I refused to let it break me. He thought he had me trapped, that he'd beaten me into submission. But he was wrong. I'd come too far, fought too hard to let him take this from me. That night, I packed my bag, my heart pounding as I went through my room, gathering everything I would need. My savings, the photos of his shady deals, the slip of paper with Lily's friend's number. I packed it all, ready to make my escape. As I crept down the hallway, the house was silent, dark, each step a small victory, each quiet breath a promise of freedom. I reached the front door, my hand on the knob, my heart racing as I prepared to step outside, to finally leave this prison behind. But just as I opened the door, a voice cut through the silence. "And where do you think you're going?" I turned, my stomach twisting as I saw Charles standing there, his face twisted with fury, his eyes dark with rage. "Did you really think you could leave without saying goodbye?" he sneered, stepping closer, his voice a low, menacing growl. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stand my ground. "I'm leaving, Charles," I said, my voice steady. "And there's nothing you can do to stop me." He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the empty hallway. "Oh, you think so? Go ahead, Emily. Run. But don't think you'll get far. I'll find you. And when I do, you'll wish you'd never left." I took a step back, my hand tightening on my bag. "Maybe. But I'd rather take my chances than spend one more second under your control." He lunged forward, grabbing my arm, his grip tight and unyielding. "You're mine, Emily," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You belong to me." I looked up at him, my eyes blazing with a defiance I hadn't felt in years. "Not anymore." With a sharp tug, I broke free from his grasp, bolting out the door, my heart pounding as I ran into the night, the cold air biting at my skin, each step a frantic, desperate bid for freedom. As I disappeared into the darkness, his voice echoed behind me, a furious, desperate scream that only fueled my determination. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running, even as the city lights faded, even as exhaustion tugged at my limbs. I'd finally done it. I was free. The air was cold and biting as I ran, each breath sharp in my lungs. My legs felt like lead, my steps uneven, but I didn't dare stop. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the sounds of the night as I fled further from the house, from him. I couldn't risk looking back, couldn't risk seeing his shadow following me. All I had was the darkness in front of me, stretching out like a promise of freedom. And I held on to that promise like my life depended on it, because in a way, it did. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs, until my breaths came in gasps and the cold air clawed at my throat. Finally, I stumbled to a stop under a flickering streetlight, leaning against a lamppost as I tried to catch my breath. The city was quiet at this hour, the streets empty, but every shadow felt like him, lurking, waiting. I forced myself to focus, to think, to remember why I'd run in the first place. I couldn't just stand here, exposed and vulnerable. I had to keep moving, find somewhere safe. But where? Then I remembered Lily's number, the crumpled slip of paper tucked into my pocket. With shaking hands, I fished it out, staring at the numbers in the dim light. This was my lifeline, my one chance. I pulled out my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed the number, praying that she'd pick up, that I hadn't misread her kindness. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I held my breath, counting each ring, my heart sinking with every second that passed. Finally, a voice came through, groggy and confused. "Hello." "Hi." I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Is this Lily's friend? There was a pause. Then the voice softened. Yes, this is Ella. Who is this? My name is Emily, I said, my voice trembling. Lily gave me your number. She said you help people. There was another pause, and I could almost feel the woman on the other end of the line assessing me, trying to figure out if I was serious. All right, Emily, she finally said, her tone gentle. Where are you? I glanced around, taking in my surroundings. I'm I'm on Oak Street, near the old library. Stay there, she said, her voice calm and steady. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Just stay where you are. I hung up, tucking my phone back into my pocket as I looked around. The street was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stay warm as I waited, every nerve on edge, every shadow a reminder of what I was leaving behind. True to her word, Ella arrived exactly 20 minutes later, her car pulling up to the curb with a quiet rumble. She stepped out, her face kind but serious as she looked me over, taking in my rumpled clothes, my dirt-streaked face, the fear in my eyes. She didn't ask any questions, didn't push for details. She just nodded, opening the passenger door and gesturing for me to get in. The warmth of the car was a relief, wrapping around me like a blanket as I settled into the seat, letting out a shaky breath. Ella got back in, her hands steady on the wheel as she pulled away from the curb, driving in silence. She didn't push me to talk, didn't ask where I was from or why I'd called her. She just let me sit there, my hands clenched in my lap, my mind racing as I tried to process everything that had just happened. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm and reassuring. We'll go to my place for now. I have a spare room you can use, and we'll figure out the rest in the morning. I nodded, swallowing down the lump in my throat. Thank you, I whispered, the words barely audible. She gave me a small smile, her gaze kind. You're safe now, Emily. Whatever you're running from, it's over. Just take a breath. I closed my eyes, letting her words wash over me. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could finally be free. When we got to her apartment, she showed me to the spare room, handing me a set of clean clothes and a towel. The bathroom's down the hall, she said, her voice soft. Take as much time as you need. I nodded, clutching the clothes to my chest as I walked to the bathroom, the warmth and quiet of the apartment settling around me like a balm. I closed the door, staring at my reflection in the mirror, at the tired eyes staring back at me, the dark smudges of exhaustion etched into my skin. I looked like a ghost, hollow and worn. But there was something else there too, something fierce, something that hadn't been there before. I took a long, hot shower, letting the water wash away the grime and tension, feeling the weight of the past months slowly melt away. When I finally emerged, dressed in the clean clothes she'd given me, I felt like I was shedding an old skin, leaving behind the version of myself that had been trapped under Charles's control. Ella was waiting in the kitchen, a cup of tea in front of her, her expression calm and understanding. She gestured for me to sit, pouring me a cup as she settled into the seat across from me. Whenever you're ready, she said, her voice gentle. You can tell me as much or as little as you want. I took a shaky breath, wrapping my hands around the warm mug, feeling the heat seep into my fingers. For a moment, I just sat there, staring into the tea, the words tangled in my throat. But finally, I found my voice, telling her everything about my mom, about Charles, about the months of abuse and manipulation, about how he'd torn down every piece of me until I felt like I had nothing left. She listened in silence, her gaze steady and compassionate, nodding as I spoke, never interrupting, never judging. When I finally finished, my voice hoarse, my eyes stinging with unshed tears, she reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on mine. You're not alone, Emily, she said softly. And you don't have to go back there. Not ever. The words hit me like a wave, a release I hadn't known I needed. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, quickly brushing it away, but Ella just squeezed my hand, letting me know it was okay to feel, to grieve, to let go. Over the next few days, Ella helped me settle into a routine, giving me a safe space to breathe, to start rebuilding. She didn't push me to talk, didn't pry into my past, but she was there, a steady presence in the background, a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I began to heal, the bruises of the past fading, the wounds closing, leaving scars that no longer felt so raw. I started working with her friend who ran a small cafe nearby, saving up the money I'd brought with me, planning my next steps. I wasn't sure where I'd go yet, but I knew that wherever it was, it would be far from the life I'd left behind. One morning, as I was wiping down the counter at the cafe, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my heart skipping a beat as I saw the caller ID. It was an unknown number, but something told me I knew exactly who it was. I answered, my voice steady. Hello. There was a pause, then a familiar, bitter voice came through the line. Emily. I took a deep breath, bracing myself. Charles. I hope you realize the trouble you've caused, he spat, his tone sharp and venomous. Do you have any idea how hard it's been explaining your little disappearance to everyone? I felt a surge of anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. I don't care, Charles, I said, my voice firm. I'm not coming back. He let out a harsh laugh. Oh, really? You think you're so clever, don't you? Running away, leaving me to deal with the mess you left behind. You're the mess, Charles. I shot back, my voice laced with anger. You made my life a prison. I won't let you control me anymore. There was silence on the other end, then a low, bitter chuckle. We'll see about that, Emily. You may have gotten away, but don't think for a second that this is over. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pushed it aside. Goodbye, Charles, I said, my voice strong and unwavering. Don't call me again. I hung up, my hands shaking, but there was a sense of finality in the air, a feeling that I'd taken the last step in breaking free from his grip. The phone call with Charles left a bitter taste in my mouth, a reminder of everything I'd been through, everything I'd fought to escape. But when I hung up, a strange sense of relief settled over me. It was as if, for the first time, I had the final word. I'd told him to stay out of my life, and now I was the one in control. He could threaten, he could make empty promises, but he couldn't touch me anymore. I was free. In the weeks that followed, life felt almost normal, whatever normal was supposed to feel like. I worked at the cafe during the day, slowly earning back what I'd saved before, and every night, I returned to Ella's apartment, where I'd built a small, quiet routine. Sometimes I'd draw in the evening, feeling my old love for it return, this time without the fear that Charles would take it from me. Ella never asked about my past, and though she knew pieces of it, she never pushed for details. She just offered a safe place, a foundation to rebuild from, and I could never thank her enough for it. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to the apartment to find Ella sitting on the couch, a thoughtful expression on her face. She looked up as I entered, giving me a warm smile. I got a call from a friend of mine today, she said, folding her hands in her lap. She works for a nonprofit organization that helps people get back on their feet, especially those coming out of difficult situations. I listened, curiosity piqued, wondering where she was going with this. They have a program that provides housing and financial support while helping you find more permanent employment, she continued. I thought it might be something you'd be interested in. You could have a place of your own, a chance to really start fresh. The thought of having my own space, my own life outside of Ella's apartment, sent a thrill through me. As much as I appreciated everything she'd done, I knew I couldn't stay here forever. I needed to find my own way, to stand on my own 2 feet. But I was also scared. The idea of being completely independent, of facing the world alone, was daunting. I, I don't know, I said, biting my lip. I mean, it sounds amazing, but I'm not sure I'm ready. Ella reached over, placing a reassuring hand on mine. You're stronger than you think, Emily. You've come so far already. This could be the next step, a way to really put the past behind you. I looked down at our joined hands, feeling a surge of gratitude. Thank you, Ella, I said softly, for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you. She squeezed my hand, giving me a kind smile. You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad I could help. You deserve a fresh start, Emily. A real chance to build the life you want. That night, I lay awake, thinking about her offer, imagining what it would be like to have my own space, a place where I could be free from the memories of Charles and everything he'd put me through. I knew I couldn't let fear hold me back. I'd already faced worse than anything life could throw at me, and I'd come out the other side. I was ready. The next morning, I told Ella I wanted to take her friend up on the offer. She made the call, arranging a meeting with the nonprofit's director. Within a week, I was moving into a small studio apartment, barely furnished, but perfect in its simplicity. For the first time, I had a space that was entirely my own, a place where I could breathe without the weight of someone else's expectations. I threw myself into my new life with a sense of determination, determined to make the most of this opportunity. I continued working at the cafe, saving every dollar, but I also began taking online classes in art and design, rekindling the dream I thought was dead. It felt good to work towards something, to have a goal that was entirely my own, untouched by anyone else. One day, as I was sketching in my apartment, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, thinking it might be spam, but something made me pick up. Hello, Emily, it's Charles. The sound of his voice sent a chill down my spine, bringing back memories I'd tried so hard to forget. My first instinct was to hang up, but something stopped me, curiosity mingling with a strange sense of power. This time, I was the one who held all the cards. What do you want? I asked, keeping my tone cold and distant. There was a pause, then a sigh, and for the first time, I heard something in his voice that sounded almost defeated. I need your help. I felt a surge of anger, my fingers tightening around the phone. Help after everything you did to me. You think I'd help you? Emily, please, he said, his voice strained. Things have fallen apart. I lost my job, my connections. People are talking about the financial missteps, the tax issues. Everything's catching up with me. I don't have anyone else to turn to. I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that seemed to surprise him. So now you're the one who's desperate? You never thought about what you put me through, did you? He hesitated, and I could hear the faint sound of him swallowing. I know I made mistakes, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But I'm asking you now, please. Just this once. I closed my eyes, memories flooding back. The cruel words, the endless nights spent cleaning, the shattered dreams he'd torn from me one by one. I thought of the way he laughed as he tore down my hopes, the way he told me I was worthless, that I'd never escape him. Charles, I said, my voice calm but firm, I want you to remember every single thing you did to me. Every insult, every lie, every way you tried to break me. And then I want you to understand that I will never help you. Emily, please. No, I interrupted, my tone hard. You don't get to play the victim now. You don't get to ask for forgiveness after everything you put me through. You made your bed, and now you can lie in it. There was silence on the other end, a heavy, defeated silence that felt like a strange kind of closure. I didn't need his apology, his regrets, his excuses. I didn't need anything from him. I had my life, my future, and for the first time, I felt like I was truly free. Goodbye, Charles, I said, my voice steady, unshaken. Don't ever call me again. I hung up, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders, a sense of finality settling over me. He was gone, his hold on me broken, and all that was left was a future I could finally claim as my own. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my art, my work, my studies, building the life I'd always dreamed of, a life that was entirely mine. And every time I picked up a pencil, every time I sketched out a new idea, I felt the chains of my past fall away, one by one. Charles had tried to control me, to break me, but in the end, he'd only made me stronger. He was nothing more than a shadow now, a distant memory that had no power over me. I was free, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe, like I could truly be myself. As I stood in my small apartment, surrounded by the sketches and dreams I'd reclaimed, I realized that I was no longer just surviving. I was living, building a life filled with purpose, with hope, with joy. And I knew, with a certainty that filled me to my core, that I would never let anyone take that from me again.